What's going on YouTube? Kevin Brown Jr. here. This is going to be the first of many maritime disaster documentaries I'm going to be doing for my channel. The first one I'm going to do is the sinking of the SS Arctic, and let me tell you, this is a pretty bad one to start on. It was a very horrible disaster. I'm not just starting off with something light here. I am hitting the nail into the wall with a massive hammer on this one. The SS Arctic was one of the 5 ships that was built for the Collins Line. Now, the Collins Line was a short-lived American shipping company, originally starting out as the I.G. Collins and Son, owned by Israel Collins. Then, after his passing, it was passed down to his son Edward Collins, who in 1849 changed the company's name to the Collins Line. As I said, the company didn't exist very long, only 9 years, and they only ever built 5 ships for the company. They were, in their constructive order, the SS Atlantic, the SS Pacific, the SS Arctic, the SS Baltic, and the SS Adriatic. The Arctic was one of the faster ships in the Collins Line, but she had ran into several incidents because of government mandates, since the Collins Line was funded by the U.S. government, that required her to travel at full speed during all times of travel. I know that sounds ridiculous and completely unreasonable, but you have to keep in mind that this was the mid-19th century, and when exactly speed and accidents were not well understood. And also, considering this is the fact that this was the first American shipping company, there was bound to be confusion. The Arctic set sail for her last voyage from Liverpool bound for New York, departing on September 20th, 1854. On September 27th, she was sailing about 50 miles or so off the east coast of Newfoundland. This is the area where the Gulf Stream and Labrador currents met, and as a result, it was common for fog to occur, especially in the early days of a new season. This was September 27th, so that it had just turned to fall a week ago, and now the climate was changing, so it was common for the area to be foggy, and today was no exception. Not far off elsewhere in the foggy area was a transportation vessel called the Vesta. The Vesta was a French transportation vessel that transported French fishermen they would transport them from France to Newfoundland during the spring to get them ready for the fishing season, and then from Newfoundland to their homes in France. Now it's September 27th, the fishing season is over, and it's time to get the men back home to their families in France for the upcoming winter. The Vesta had departed St. John's on September 26th, just the day before. It was the second day of her voyage. Around 11:45 a.m., the 2 ships spotted each other, but a blanket of fog rolled in and blocked them off, both captains believing that one or the other would get out of each other's way. But at around 11:57 a.m., the Vesta reappeared, much closer to the Arctic. The 2 ships did what they could, but unfortunately, they counteracted each other's maneuvers, which meant that they couldn't get out of the way. In order for them to get out of danger, they both would have had to steer starboard or port. But since they counteracted each other's movements, it only continued to get them in each other's paths. At the strike of noon, the 2 ships collided bow to bow, with the Arctic continuing to speed forward while the Vesta came to a stop. As the Arctic continued to steam ahead, the Vesta was scraping along the Arctic's hull until it eventually banged against the paddle box, I believe on the starboard side, and were separated. Now, for the first few minutes, the crew of the Arctic were secure in the idea that their ship was safe. The ship did not appear to be listening to either starboard or port, and her speed had hardly been slowed by the collision. The crew made a brief inspection of the bow where it occurred, and it seemed like everything was okay. The vibration wasn't that heavy either. A second-class passenger who was at the stern, the furthest point of contact, said that the collision felt like little more than a bump. This was probably because the Arctic was bigger and wider than the Vesta, so it probably didn't feel the collision as bad. While the Arctic seemed stable, the same could not be said for the Vesta. The Vesta's length had been reduced by a full 10 feet as a result of the collision, and water was now pouring into the wide open wound at the front, causing the ship to list forward. People on the Vesta were panicking, bumping into each other and running into one another. Dead bodies were being washed off the bow of the Vesta that had been crushed to death and grinded in the damaged area. And the water began to turn red as the blood from the dismembered bodies had also began to wash onto the deck. There was complete chaos. It's said that a group of 12 people also launched a lifeboat against the captain's orders, believing that there was no hope staying on board. Even from a distance, the crew of the Arctic could see the Vesta sinking, and they could hear the people crying out. Captain James Luce, the captain of the Arctic, believing that his ship had only suffered mild damage and that the Vesta was in serious danger of sinking, ordered his ship to turn to starboard and backtrack to the wreck site. But this was the first mistake they made. Turning the ship to starboard meant that it would dip the wounds where the Arctic had suffered, where the collision had occurred, lower into the water. Along with that, passengers and crew gathered onto the starboard railing, which also contributed to the Arctic gaining a slight list to starboard. But even now, the crew was not concerned yet. They still believed that their ship was safe, and they were much more concerned about the Vesta. As the Arctic continued making her turn, the ship's chief officer, Robert Gourlay, took with him a crew of 6, and the 7 of them took command of Lifeboat 1, lowered into the water, and waited until the Vesta was visible again. When the Vesta was visible again to the crew, they cut the falls and began riding to the Vesta to provide assistance as they abandoned the Vesta. But as the Arctic finished her turn, the captain and a few crew members noticed something. The ship's starboard list did not recover after the ship straightened out, and the bow was slowly beginning to settle into the water. Most of the passengers and crew were far too distracted by what was going on with the Vesta. Only the captain and a few crew members paid attention to what was going on with the Arctic. But shortly after the Arctic stopped, the crew realized that something was wrong with the ship. Captain Luce had to pause giving further help to the Vesta and temporarily focused on saving his own ship. But when 2 out of 3 attempts to slow the flooding failed, the Captain Luce realized that there was nothing, that he wouldn't be able to help the Vesta anymore. He had to focus on his own ship. There was only one safe thing left he could do to secure survival for the Arctic and its passengers: to chart a course for the nearest port and begin making way toward that port. This would mean abandoning the Vesta, but Captain Luce rationalized that staying with the Vesta was a lost cause. He believed that the heavily wounded ship would sink at any minute, and that continuing to stay with the Vesta to help them might as well doom his passengers and crew to the same fate. The crew navigated the charts and quickly discovered that the nearest port was in Newfoundland, was, I believe, around Broad Cove, perhaps somewhere around that area, 50 miles to the east. There was no way they could spend time looking for Chief Officer Gourlay's boat, which had now disappeared into the fog. The nearest port was 50 miles away. Now, a modern cruise ship could probably make that distance in just an hour or so, especially going at full speed. But a mid-19th century ship, especially a wounded one, with only one funnel, it would take at least 4 hours to get there. Absolutely every ounce of steam and every second of time had to be focused on getting the ship to shore. The crew made a vain and half-hearted attempt to try and signal Gourlay's boat, but it had vanished into the fog and there was nothing more they could do. In the end, Captain Luce was left with no choice. He turned on the ship's steam and began heading to port, leaving Officer Gourlay and his 6 crewmen to their fate. A few minutes, however, after the Arctic left the crash scene, a lifeboat did come up alongside the starboard area, but it was not Officer Gourlay's boat. It was a lifeboat that had been launched by the Vesta against the captain's orders with 12 men on board. Unfortunately, it was pulled under the ship's starboard paddle wheel and minced and chopped to pieces. 11 of the 12 occupants were also sucked under the paddle wheel. Passengers and crew said they could hear the screams of people inside the paddle wheel, but within moments, the water around the paddle wheel turned red, and the screams ceased. There was a lone survivor, Francois Jassinet, who bravely jumped out of the lifeboat into the 45-degree water and grabbed onto the falls where Officer Gourlay's boat, Lifeboat 1, was hanging, and he was pulled aboard. As the Arctic made her way toward shore, the crew began making preparations, including getting the lifeboats ready and getting the provisions ready as well. But there weren't any orders to launch them just yet. For now, the crew's absolute goal was to get the ship to shore. The Arctic left the scene of the crash at 12:40 p.m., 40 minutes after the collision. At or around 1 o'clock, something happened. The ship vibrated fiercely, and large clouds of soot erupted through the funnels. This was the water coming in and beginning to douse the fires. After these vibrations died down, the Arctic gradually began losing steam. It seemed the more distance she covered, the slower she traveled. By 1:30, her speed had already been chopped down from 12 knots to a sluggish 4. The crew began to realize that they wouldn't be able to get to shore. Their goal now was to get the Arctic as close to land as possible and give them the shortest journey. But Captain Luce had other plans. He decided to go ahead he told his crew, "We're not going to make it. We're going to go ahead with the evacuation. We've slowed enough down we can launch the boats." In compliance with the poor lifeboat regulations of the mid-19th century, the Arctic did not have enough lifeboats to accommodate everyone on board. Even if Officer Gourlay's boat had remained, there still wouldn't have been enough. Now that Gourlay's boat had been left behind, there were only 5 lifeboats. This indeed was not enough to save the remaining 408 people on board, but it was enough to save all the women and children. Was just checking on the pot, boiling water, making dinner. So it was enough to accommodate all the women and children on board. The first lifeboat to be used in the evacuation was Lifeboat 2 on the starboard side. This lifeboat was professionally filled with women and children, crewmen and provisions. Then it was to be captained by the ship's butcher and a few sailors. Unfortunately for them, they rowed off into the wrong direction. They actually began heading eastward as if they were trying to go back to the crash site. Perhaps the crew had poor navigation skills, or perhaps the fog made it hard to tell which direction was which. Either way, it was a fatal mistake, for they rowed off into the wrong direction, disappeared into the fog, and that was the last anyone saw of them. On the other side of the ship, Lifeboat 4 was being loaded with women and children, but before they could finish loading it, a group of rebellious crewmen stormed it. Officers drew their pistols and shot some of the raiders down, but not all. The raiders who managed to get past them caused the lifeboat to upset, and eventually it rolled over and dumped all of the women and children inside, and all but 3 of the male raiders inside, and they later died there. The 3 men who did not fall out and raided the boat would go on to survive the disaster. At 1:45 p.m., 65 minutes after leaving the crash site, the funnel puffed out a few last clouds of very thin smoke, and with that, the steam finally runs out. Consequently, the steam powered the ship's electricity and the bilge pumps. The ship came to a standstill and the power ran out. Now only the buckets, cups, and manual hand pumps stood between the ship and free-flowing water. There was one positive benefit to the ship running out of steam and stopping, though. The passengers who had been dumped out of Lifeboat 4 were only a few hundred yards behind the ship when it came to a standstill, and were making their way toward the now still ship. Captain Luce saw this as an opportunity to use Lifeboats 3 and 4 to rescue passengers and crew. As Lifeboat 4 recovered its keel and was being loaded once more, Captain Luce ordered the ship's second officer, William Ballum, and about 14 other men to get into the Lifeboat 3 and lower it into the water and wait there to pick up swimmers. But before this could happen, a group of 14 men, 13 crew and 1 passenger, dived over the railing and pulled their way into Officer Ballum's boat, further filling it, but not to capacity. Despite the fact that his boat still wasn't full, Ballum, perhaps in panic, cut the falls, circled around the back of the ship to the starboard side, and began heading westward toward Newfoundland. Much like Captain Smith on the Titanic, Captain Luce drew his speaking megaphone and tried to call Lifeboat 3 back to the ship. And much like the lifeboat that Captain Smith on the Titanic was calling to, Ballum and the crew evaded him and disappeared into the fog. Captain Luce went to the crew of Lifeboat 4 and told them of Ballum's mutiny and asked some of the occupants to get out of the boat so they could make way for the swimmers of the original occupants of this lifeboat. Most of them complied, with the exception of a sailor who drew a knife and challenged the captain. Captain Luce drew a mallet and the two of them fought, with Captain Luce coming out on top. Unfortunately, just as the lifeboat was once again being filled, it was once again raided by rebellious crewmen. Officers once again drew their pistols and shot some of them down, but other raiders got past them. This time, instead of flipping over, the boat free fell into the water, and one of the occupants, using an axe, cut the falls. The boat's oars had fallen off and there was no way to reach them. Captain Luce drew his megaphone and tried to call the boat back to the ship, unaware that the oars was not with it. The boat was carried off into the fog, vanishing. Now all the lifeboats that had been hanging on the deck were gone, and there were 2 collapsibles left. These collapsibles could fit roughly 70 of the 300 or so people on board. Indeed, this was a bad dilemma. But Captain Luce knew that they had to focus on getting these 2 lifeboats ready, and what they would do afterward would have to be focused on later. Captain Luce held a meeting with his crew, and they began organizing the lifeboats. First, organizing lifeboat collapsible A and putting it on the port side falls, but when they went to collect collapsible B, they were horrified to discover that it and the majority of the engineering crew were missing. A second-class passenger told Captain Luce that he saw the chief engineer and some other engineers loading the lifeboats with provisions. When he inquired as to what their intentions were, the chief engineer told him that they were going to circle around the ship and plug up any holes or broken windows to buy some extra time, and that the reason they were loading it with provisions was so that they wouldn't have to do it later. The passenger trusted them, but his trust was betrayed when he saw them lower the boat, cut the falls, and began riding westward off into the fog. Swimmers tried to get on, and when they did, they were threatened with firearms. Despite the fact that the lifeboat was only a quarter full, the engineers refused to bring anyone on board. Now there was 1 lifeboat left that had enough room for 35 out of the remaining 280 or so people on board. Indeed, this was a dilemma, and panic was rapidly beginning to rise as the crew knew there was only 1 lifeboat left. Captain Luce knew this 1 lifeboat would not be enough to keep things under control. Not only had most of the officers had gone, but almost all of the women and children were still aboard the ship, including the wife and 2 of the 3 children of Edward Collins, who I mentioned earlier was the owner of the Collins line, along with family members of James Brown, the president of the bank who funded Collins line, and a man named George Allen, who was an attorney who worked for the Novelty Iron Works that built the ship's engines, as well as his wife Grace Allen and their 1-year-old son Hebert, and Captain Luce's 11-year-old disabled son Willie. All of them were still on board. And almost all of the officers had gone now. In fact, the only officers still left on the ship were Captain Luce himself and 4th Officer Francis Dorian. Officer Dorian told Captain Luce that he would remain loyal to him and asked for instructions. Captain Luce told him that he had ordered the carpenter and some skilled woodmen to begin the construction of a large improvised raft, and ordered Dorian to use collapsible A as a platform in the water to supervise the raft's construction and ensure that his boat and the raft would not be stolen away. As the construction of the large improvised raft began, passengers and crew also began building their own rafts. Using couches, deck chairs, barrels, anything they could find, they fastened these together to provide additional means of escape. Collapsible A, the large improvised raft, and the smaller rafts being constructed by the passengers and crew were the only remaining hopes of escape. At this point, the chaos continues, and those on the ship split into three different groups. The first groups are those who do whatever they can to construct rafts using any material they can find, hoping to provide additional means of survival for them and any others. The second group was comprised of mostly women and children who surrendered to their fate and got onto the deck in the middle of the ship and quietly prayed to the Lord. The third group saw it as an opportunity to just do whatever they wanted. They broke into the liquor cabinet and quickly drank themselves crazy. They began fighting with each other, stealing money and life belts. Some of them came back on deck and even attempted to rape some of the women on board. They had just saw this as an opportunity to just do whatever they wanted, not thinking about what God would have said. In their eyes, they were being worldly, believing they could do whatever they want and nothing would happen. As these men attempted to rape some of the women, a group of gentlemen rushed in to protect them, and a violent brawl broke out, and it is almost certain that men on both sides of this brawl lost their lives. I'm sad to say that some of these men who attempted to rape the woman also raided the improvised raft and collapsible A chartered by Officer Dorian. Dorian and the raft builders did whatever they could to fight some of them off, including striking them down with axes, hammers, and Dorian's pistol, but there was just too many of them. Now, the large improvised raft and collapsible A were gone. Aside from the mini rafts that the crew and passengers were constructing, every means of escape was now depleted. Captain Luce told the crew that it was every man for himself, handed out life belts, and then went below to collect his son. Before he went to collect his son, he ordered an engineer apprentice, a 22-year-old named Stuart Holland, to place the ship's cannon at the starboard bow, the starboard side, and begin firing the cannonballs every minute from the starboard side, hoping to attract the attention of a passing ship. He was shocked when he came back on deck to see Holland still doing this. The stern began to drop. Even though the damage was at the bow, the Arctic only had one compartment, so whatever direction the passengers and crew would go in, the ship would list to that side, and the construction of the large improvised raft, collapsible A, and the mini rafts was mostly at the back of the ship, so now the ship was beginning to sink by the stern. Even though the wound on the starboard side was now far above the water that was now flowing to the Arctic stern was making her lower until water would eventually come over the railing. The ship began dropping into the sea with every minute that passed. Passengers and crew began panicking. Many of those who were constructing the mini rafts were now out of time, and the rafts would have to float as they are. Some of the crew were even still trying to work the hand pumps, even up to that point as the ship was half submerged, including a stewardess named Anna Downer, who was relieved by Captain Luce of her duties, but she continued to do it anyway, even as the ship was going under. Sadly, she did not survive the sinking. Captain Luce saw Stuart Holland still firing the cannons. Before firing his last one, he turned to Captain Luce and his son and said, "My duty is finished. Let the world know that at least one man stood by his post during this disaster." The bow rose to an angle of about 45 degrees, looking opposite of the Titanic since her bow was under and her stern was sticking out at an angle of 30 to 45 degrees. Around 4:47 p.m., 4 hours and 47 minutes after the collision, the Arctic finally sank beneath the waves. Captain Luce and his son broke the surface and submerged several times after the ship went down. During one of the submergings, he lost grip of his son. When he broke the surface for the final time, he found his son a short distance away and began swimming toward him. When the Arctic struck the sea floor, the starboard paddle box, which had been damaged by the Vesta colliding with it, broke free from the ship and returned to the surface. Almost vertically it returned, and then it rolled over, striking and killing several people in the water. And I'm sad to say that Captain Luce's 11-year-old son, Willie, was among them. Captain Luce himself was hit badly on the head by a railing that stuck out from the box, but was able to swim and climb aboard the paddle box as a raft. Others had climbed aboard too. Most were strangers to Captain Luce, with the exception of George Allen. When Captain Luce inquired to George Allen as to what happened to his wife and son, he told him they got separated during the final plunge. A short time later, he found his wife and son swimming toward the paddle box. He tried to grab her, but the water was constantly moving up and down. A swell was beginning to pick up shortly after the ship went down, and it was just too much. She gave up and swam to another raft with Hebert, and sadly, the two of them died there. The group began to spread apart really quickly. Unlike the sinking of the Titanic, Lusitania, and Empress of Ireland, where everyone was in that group, people and rafts and everything began to disperse quickly as a swell began to pick up. Everything had just drifted away. The first people to be rescued were those aboard lifeboat Collapsible A, chartered by Officer Dorian. They were rescued late the next morning by the Huron, which was a bark bound for Quebec. As Collapsible A made its way toward the Huron, they found the large improvised raft that the carpenter and woodworkers were making, drifting in splintered pieces with only a single survivor on board, a second-class 25-year-old waiter named Thomas McCabe. McCabe was not among the men who raided the raft, but grabbed onto the raft in the water and pulled himself from the water after the Arctic went down. Now, he was the only one who made it. He said that about 2 hours after the raft drifted away, after the sinking, when the raft had drifted away, far enough away that no one else would be grabbing onto it, he took account of how many people were on board, and he counted 68 men and 4 women. Unfortunately, he could feel the raft slowly buckling and settling into the water, realizing that there were too many people on board, but he couldn't just ask anyone to get off. Their best hopes were that someone would find them before the raft broke to pieces, which did not happen. Everyone else either drifted away or chose to swim away. He was the only one who stuck with it, and he said that he was so weak that he felt he was within 10 minutes of death when he was rescued. About 2 days afterward, the Huron linked up with the Lebanon, which was going to New York, and it gave the survivors the opportunity to transfer to the Lebanon and go straight into New York, because if they stayed with the Huron, they would have to go into Quebec and find means to get down to New York after that. Those in Officer Dorian's boat, including Dorian himself, who acted nobly, decided to transfer to the Lebanon and head directly to New York, while those who acted more shamefully decided to stick with the Huron and went to Newfoundland and emigrated there. They never left. They decided to remain in Newfoundland in Quebec for the remainder of their lives, perhaps too ashamed to ever go back to America. Some of the rafts, including the paddle box where Captain Luce was on, were rescued. But by the time the paddle box had been rescued 2 days after the disaster, the number of survivors on board had reduced from a dozen to a trio: Captain Luce, George Allen, and one of the ship's sailors. Some of those on the mini rafts had also been rescued by the ship that rescued the paddle box. The ship that rescued them was the Cambria, captained by Captain Russell. One of the people rescued was Francois Jassanin, the sailor who had survived from Vesta's lifeboat. 2 more lifeboats, meanwhile, back out in the Atlantic, 2 more lifeboats had reached shore 2 days after the disaster. Collapsible B, which was stolen by the engineers, and Lifeboat 3, which was stolen by Officer Ballum, made their way to shore. When they reached St. John's, Newfoundland, they were shocked to discover the Vesta was at the repair dock. Yes, the Vesta that had collided with the Arctic and seemed that it was going to sink. By a miracle, they managed to get the ship to port safely. I'm sad to say that the crew of the Vesta did not find Officer Gourlay's boat. You remember early in the disaster, Gourlay had taken the lifeboat with 6 crewmen to go and give them assistance. but they never made it to the Vesta, and whatever happened to them remains a mystery. Although their lifeboat was found about 20 miles offshore in November of that year in good condition, but nobody was inside it. Lifeboat 4, which had been twice stormed and raided, also drifted ashore in December on a snowy day, also with nobody inside. Lifeboat 2, the only lifeboat to be professionally loaded with women and children, but rode off into the wrong direction and was never found at all, like I said, just disappeared, was never found. This was the only lifeboat that was never recovered from the Arctic, and their fate remains a complete mystery. All in all, after doing the tallies, it was discovered that 88 had survived the disaster to a loss of 320, and I'm sad to say that not a single woman or child made it. All of the survivors were men. 64 were members of the crew, 23 were male passengers, and one, Francoise Jassinet, was a transfer. As you can well imagine, there was great outrage and sorrow as to the fact that not a single woman or child made it, as well as the poor professionalism that occurred during the evacuation. Some of those, including those in Collapsible B and Officer Ballum from Lifeboat 3, and the 3 men who survived after raiding Lifeboat 4, had tried to pin the blame on Captain Luce, saying it was his fault. But Luce was generally exonerated from blame, and those who had done horrible actions were given their criticism. People have questioned Officer Ballum as to why he took the lifeboat when he was supposed to use it to pick up swimmers. He tried to say that after the men raided his lifeboat that it was full, and he had no choice but to cut the falls and ride away. But people in his lifeboat testified against him, saying that after the raid, his lifeboat was only half full, and he could have saved about 20 people, but didn't. When he was caught in the sly, he tried to blame Captain Luce, but as I said, Captain Luce was exonerated from blame, and Officer Ballum received his criticism. Ballum and Luce would remain enemies for the remainder of their lives. The engineers who stole Collapsible B also faced criticism and tried unsuccessfully to blame the captain. Captain Luce lived until 1876. The last survivor, a 16-year-old sailor, passed away in June 1911, almost 60 years after the disaster. The wreckage of the Arctic has never been explored or discovered. Divers and researchers have no intent really to discover her, believing that by this point in time, the ship's wooden structure is probably gone. There are no known artifacts that have been discovered about her, and few memorials exist. The Arctic was indeed one of the worst maritime disasters of the mid-19th century, and sadly, it also began the downfall of the Collins Line, as the Collins Line would begin to suffer financially from the loss of the Arctic. Of course, Edward Collins would suffer personally when he would learn that his wife and 2 of his 3 children who were on board were lost in the disaster. That is it for this documentary on the SS Arctic. I hope you all enjoyed it. And next I will be doing a documentary probably on another ship on the Collins Line.